Back at the beginning of last year, I made a video titled, "Is the Mavic Pro worth buying in 2021?" In that video, I broke down my thoughts on why I thought the Mavic Pro was still a very relevant and usable drone even 5 years after its release. And now if you fast forward to today, 2023 is only a month away, and I still have my Mavic Pro. It is chilling right back here, and I still use it for personal projects as well as this YouTube channel. But for my professional work, I've started shooting on the DJI Air 2S. And that kind of got me thinking. I've never flown those two drones back to back, and I've never really compared the footage between the two. Obviously, the Air 2S has a bigger sensor and is just all around a more modern and more sophisticated drone, but how much better is it than the Mavic Pro? That is what we're going to find out. And I think to start with, we're going to go over some of the differences that you don't see on a spec sheet, but are apparent if you fly both of these drones back to back. The Air 2S is the easier of the two to fly, and I don't know if this comes down to the lighter weight, the smaller size, or the more powerful motors, but I did do a test where I started at the exact same point, and the Mavic Pro kind of struggled with the headwind. It got blown off course a little bit, and I had to correct it, but the Air 2S was easily able to overcome the headwind and the resistance. It didn't get kind of pushed left or right at all, and I was able to get the shot the first time. And this was a trend that carried through during the day. The Air 2S, I was able to fly a more precise line and get the shot a little easier than I was with the Mavic Pro. The Mavic Pro just kind of was struggling all day long. And I think this just comes down to the Air 2S being a newer drone and having more sophisticated hardware. But that is something to note, as well as the gimbal control. So the gimbal on the Air 2S is smoother, has less vibration, and in my opinion was just overall an easier gimbal to control than the Mavic Pro. And this probably has a lot to do with the size. So the size of the Air 2S gimbal is significantly bigger and heavier than the Mavic Pro. And I think that size just really helps to smooth out any small vibrations, as well as it just being, again, a newer product. And I think that DJI is using a better gimbal for this. And so that is another difference. When I was trying to get shots with both of these drones, I was able to get exactly the shot I wanted with the Air 2S. With the Mavic Pro, I often find myself having to fly the same path a couple times to get the shot. And if you are going to be flying professionally, producers do expect you to get the shot the first time, and a lot of times you only get one shot at it. And so having a drone that's a little more reliable, a gimbal that's a little more reliable, definitely is a perk that you're not going to see on a spec sheet, but is a difference between these two. And if we look at the image quality for video between these two drones, the biggest difference is sharpness. So the Mavic Pro has a very, very sharp image, where the Air 2S's image is much less sharp, but is still very detailed. And I think there's a difference between detail and sharpness. If you are used to shooting with cinema cameras, they are very detailed but not super sharp, and that creates a very pleasing image to the eye. The Air 2S footage feels more cinematic, and it feels very detailed but not overly sharp, whereas the Mavic Pro just has way too much sharpness added to the image, and really no matter what you do in post, you can't really pull this out. You also notice some moire in the Mavic Pro, and that I think is mostly due to how sharp that sensor is. It's much less of a problem with the Air 2S, and this is definitely the biggest difference I've noticed image quality wise between the two. Another difference is bit depth. So the Mavic Pro tops out at a 8-bit 420 image, shooting with D-Cine-Lake. And then the Air 2S can shoot 10-bit 422 with the full D-Log profile. And so you get a little more dynamic range out of the Air 2S, And I did 2 shots that were evenly exposed. So the Mavic Pro and the Air 2S were shooting at the exact same exposure. And you can see the one building on the Mavic Pro is clipped or blown out. Whereas with the Air 2S, the building is still very salvageable. And that has a lot to do with it being 10-bit footage and also being D-Log. The last big difference you'll notice between the two is the field of view. The Air 2S shoots at 22 millimeters, whereas the Mavic Pro is 28 millimeters. And on paper, that doesn't sound like a huge difference, but when you get down pretty much anything below 35 millimeters, a few millimeters can make a huge difference. And I personally, I like the wider field of view of the Air 2S. There are some perks to having, a 28 millimeter. You can get some more parallaxing, but overall, I prefer the wider field of view. It's easier to compose shots. It's easier to get the whole composition in frame. And also, if you are flying close to stuff, that perception of speed is amplified because of how wide the lens is. So that is another perk to the Air 2S, but also the Mavic Pro shooting a little more telephoto actually has a few perks of its own. Now, when we look at the image quality for photo, the Air 2S wins, but it's not the runaway win that I was kind of expecting. The Air 2S has a 20 megapixel sensor and the Mavic Pro has a 12 megapixel sensor. But even given the bump in megapixels, I would say that the detail between both of these photos is really close, and the sharpness of the Mavic Pro is still there even in raw photos. So it is really, really baked into the image. And I think for that, the Air 2S photos look a little more pleasing and a little more realistic. But if you do grade up the photos, they do grade very similar. They have similar amounts of dynamic range. I would say the Air 2S is a little better. It has a little more dynamic range. And I also like the color of the Air 2S a little more. So I think DJI has kind of tweaked the sensor a bit. But overall, I would say that both of these drones are very capable at taking photos, but I thought the Air 2S would have more of an advantage given the 20 megapixel 1-inch sensor. And that just goes to show just how good the Mavic Pro has kind of aged over these past almost 7 years. That is going to do it. Obviously, if we were giving out a trophy, the Air 2S is the clear winner, but we all knew that. I just wanted to make this video to talk about, kind of aside from the specs that you see on paper, how these two drones differ, and maybe you have a Mavic Pro and you're thinking about updating, or you just wanted to kind of see the difference between how an old drone compares to one of the newer DJI drones. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in another one.